You are already an explorer of altered consciousness. You do it every night. You lie down, close your eyes, and for 8 hours you dissolve into a world where nothing makes sense and you have no reliable idea who you are. And then you wake up. You call it sleep, you call it dreaming. You shower, you make a coffee, and you never once stop to question what that says about the boundaries you were so certain are real. Some people do stop. They look at the territory behind their eyelids and decide it's not enough to visit by accident. They want to understand what happens when the walls come down. And when they set out to find answers, the people they follow are usually the ones with the sharpest minds. The philosophers, the scientists, the people who stood at the edge of the abyss and described its dimensions with extraordinary precision. People like Aldous Huxley. In 1953, Huxley swallowed 1/10 of a gram of mescaline and sat in his study in West Hollywood, watching a vase of flowers become the first thing he had truly seen in his life. He wrote it down, he published it. Millions of people read it and understood something about the mind they had not understood before. The reducing valve. The idea that the brain filters out vastness to keep us sane, and that the sane version of reality is a heavily edited lie. It's a beautiful theory, and like most beautiful theories, it has a limit. It assumes the point of any inner journey is to understand the terrain, that if you can describe the mechanism, you've mastered the experience. Huxley spent his life at that limit and he couldn't cross it. The observer in him wouldn't let go. But someone else did. Someone who understood something that no philosopher, no theory of consciousness has ever been able to account for from a safe distance. Not because she was smarter or had the right education or the right framework, but because she'd done something far more difficult. She'd given herself to another person, not as a case study, but as a companion. And she'd discovered that the most terrifying territory a human being can enter is not the one with no walls. It's the one where the walls between self and other dissolve, and all that's left is the raw, exposed fact of another person's presence. Her name was Laura Archera. She met Aldous Huxley in the early 1950s, and when the moment came, she would prove in the most extreme circumstances imaginable that the deepest explorations of the mind are not voyages of intellectual discovery. They are acts of vulnerability, and the person who accompanies you matters more than the substance, more than the setting, more than the beautiful theory you brought with you.
835.
Her name was Laura Archera. She was born in Turin on the 2nd of November 1911. Her father was a violinist. Her mother had studied piano before marriage. In their household, music wasn't entertainment. It was the air you breathed, the language you spoke before you spoke anything else. And by the time Laura was 10, she'd stopped playing the violin. She started inhabiting it. There's a difference. Playing is what you do when you've learned the notes. Inhabiting is when the music moves through you so completely that the boundary between the musician and the sound dissolves. The adults around her noticed. A child who didn't treat the violin as a task to be mastered but as a language to be spoken. A child who listened to music the way most people listen to silence, completely. She studied in Berlin, in Paris, in Rome, earning a diploma of musical teaching before she turned 18. She crossed the Atlantic and enrolled at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, one of the most demanding conservatories in the world. This was the early 1930s. A young European woman, barely out of her teens, walking into a room full of prodigies from every corner of the world. And she held her own. She performed at Carnegie Hall before she was 20. She played before the Queen of Italy at the age of 14. By her early 20s, she was building a reputation as a musician of rare interpretive depth, the kind of player who made audiences forget they were sitting in a concert hall. And then her hand betrayed her. And I don't mean that she injured it, I mean it broke, in the way that bodies break for musicians who've poured everything into their craft. The tendons in her left hand, repetitive strain, micro-trauma accumulated over years of 8-hour practice sessions, of perfecting passages that demanded the same precise motion thousands of times until the body itself rebels. There is no single dramatic moment, no fall, no accident, just a slow, grinding correction. The body saying, "You have asked too much. One day you can play, the next day your hand will not obey." And no amount of willpower, no quantity of discipline or devotion will convince your tendons that they owe you a career. To have built your entire identity around a single soaring purpose, to have poured years of discipline into something that lived in your body, in the muscles of your hands, in the ear that could hear a quarter tone of difference, and then to have it taken from you. Not through lack of talent, not through failure, through the simple, indifferent mechanics of flesh and bone. Most people never recover from that kind of loss, not really. They construct a new identity on top of the old one, and they carry on and they function. But something essential has been closed off, a door that won't open again. They learn to live with the silence where the music used to be. Laura did something different. She didn't build on top of the loss, she went through it. She sat in the wreckage of who she'd been and asked the only question that matters. What remains when everything you thought you are is taken away? Some years passed. She learned to live without the violin. The silence was uncomfortable, but she didn't run from it. She moved to the United States, and by 1949 she was working as a freelance documentary filmmaker, moving through the world with a different kind of instrument, learning to observe rather than perform. And somewhere in that transition, something shifted. The woman who'd spent her life interpreting music through her body began interpreting suffering through her mind. She trained as a psychotherapist. She studied the emerging tradition of humanistic psychology, the work that was beginning to challenge the rigid orthodoxies of the day. And of course, Laura being Laura, she didn't simply adopt someone else's framework. She built her own, shaped by everything she'd learned in the wreckage of her musical life. She worked with veterans, with trauma survivors, with people the medical establishment had quietly decided were beyond repair. There was a man who came to her, a veteran, who hadn't slept properly in months. He sat in her office and couldn't make eye contact. He spoke in fragments, starting sentences and then stopping, as if the words themselves were dangerous. Laura didn't push. She didn't offer an interpretation. She sat with him week after week in the silence and the fragments until he began to trust that the room was a place where he wouldn't be abandoned. It took months. There was no breakthrough moment, just the slow, unglamorous accumulation of presence offered and presence received. And eventually, the man slept. She had learned something that no textbook would ever teach. Healing is not a technical process. The most important thing a therapist offers is not a clever framework or a well-worded interpretation. It is a presence, the simple, radical act of being in the room with another person and refusing to look away. Now, of course, this wasn't abstract knowledge for her. She'd learned it in her own body, in the years after her injury, when the identity she'd built was stripped away and she was forced to discover what remained. The self is not a thing you possess. It is a thing you participate in. It lives in the space between people. When she met Aldous Huxley in the early 1950s, she wasn't dazzled by his intellect. She was interested in his humanity. She brought to their relationship not the reverence of a student for a master, but the grounded understanding of someone who'd spent years learning how to sit with another person in the darkest moments of their life. The kind of understanding that doesn't come from reading books, the kind that comes from having nothing left to lose. Huxley could map the territory of consciousness with extraordinary precision. He could give you the theory, the language, the framework, but when the moment came to step beyond the map, to enter the territory itself, he couldn't do it alone. Laura could, because her entire life had been a preparation for exactly this kind of surrender, the loss of her music, the years of sitting with people in the wreckage of their own lives, the work of learning that presence is the only thing that heals. She would prove this in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, but we're not there yet. We're still at the beginning, standing in Turin, watching a girl draw a bow across strings, not knowing what the music is preparing her for. By the late 1950s, Aldous Huxley had travelled further into the philosophy of perception than almost anyone alive. The Doors of Perception had been published in 1954. Heaven and Hell would follow in 1956. He'd articulated the reducing valve theory with a precision that made most of the century look sloppy by comparison. When Huxley wrote about the architecture of the mind, people listened. He'd earned that authority through decades of rigorous, uncompromising thought. This was not a man dabbling at the edges of an interesting idea. This was a man who had committed his entire intellectual life to understanding consciousness and produce work of genuine, lasting significance. But there was a limit. Huxley could describe what consciousness looked like when the filter opened. He could explain, in language of extraordinary beauty, the geometry of perception without the reducing valve. His account of sitting in his study in West Hollywood in 1953 watching that vase of flowers remains one of the most precise and evocative descriptions of altered consciousness ever written. Huxley had earned his place in the history of thought about consciousness, no question about it. What he couldn't do was let go. The observer in him was always present, always maintaining that final protective distance between the experience and the one having it. He was a man who could tell you what it meant to see the world without limits. He just couldn't do it himself without someone holding his hand. And that distance isn't a flaw. It's the thing that made his work possible. You can't observe what you've dissolved into. Huxley's gift was also his cage. And this is where Laura steps in. The history of psychedelic exploration is for the most part a history of people writing about LSD, psilocybin and mescaline. We've mapped the receptors, we've measured the effects on default mode networks, we've published papers with titles like Serotonergic Correlates of Ego Dissolution that tell you everything about the chemistry and nothing about what it actually feels like to sit across from someone you love while the architecture of the self comes apart. Laura Huxley wasn't interested in the chemistry, she was interested in the person. She'd spent the better part of 2 decades sitting with people whose worlds had collapsed, people whose sense of self had been shattered and who'd been told in one way or another that they were beyond mending. And she'd learnt something that no textbook could have ever taught her. The thing that heals is not the interpretation, it's the presence of another human being in the room, refusing to leave. She'd learned this from her own life, from the years after her injury when the identity she'd built was stripped away and she was forced to discover what remains. The self is not a thing you hold, it's a thing you participate in. It lives in the space between people, and she carried that understanding into every session, every conversation, every moment of sitting with someone in the remains of their own life. She went on to publish 5 books on human relations and well-being, including You Are Not the Target in 1963, This Timeless Moment in 69, Between Heaven and Earth in 74, One a Day Reason to Be Happy in 86, and The Child of Your Dreams in 87. There's a little bibliography for you to go and check out. I'll put that in the show notes. Not by retreating into theory, but by leaning into connection. She believed that imagination was the key to healing, but she also understood something most theorists never grasp. Imagination without relationship is just fantasy. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are only become real when they are witnessed by another person. You are sitting with someone you love, someone whose well-being is bound up with your own, and the boundaries begin to dissolve, not abstractly or philosophically, in the body. The carefully maintained structures of self and other start to disappear, and what rushes in to fill the gap is not a theory, it is another person, undeniable. In that moment, everything you think you know about consciousness becomes background noise. The reducing valve, the mind at large, the architecture of perception, all of it secondary to a single, terrifying question. Can I be here, fully here with this person, without reaching for the safety of my own mind? Laura had known this for years. She had known it in the therapeutic room sitting across from someone whose world had collapsed. She'd known it in her own life after the injury, when the identity she built was stripped away and she was faced with the bare question of who she was. She'd known it long before she ever met Aldous Huxley. And now she was about to be tested in ways that would make all of that look like preparation. Because the man she loved was dying, and the question was no longer theoretical. Can you sit with someone in the territory between life and death without flinching, without retreating, without reaching for the comfort of a beautiful idea? She could. She would. And when the moment came, it would break every assumption about what it means to be present with another human being. The map would not be enough. By the early 1960s, Aldous Huxley was dying. Cancer. The kind of diagnosis that doesn't negotiate and doesn't much care how many books you've written or how elegant your theories are. The man who'd spent decades contemplating the nature of consciousness was now facing the most fundamental alteration of all, the dissolution of the self. Not a philosophical proposition, not as a thought experiment, as a physical, irreversible, deeply personal fact. There's no philosophy adequate to the experience of dying. All of it becomes background noise in the face of the body's slow, relentless shutdown. Huxley could describe the mechanics of consciousness with the precision of a watchmaker, but no amount of precision prepares you for the moment when the watch stops. It is not peaceful, not at first. It is your body shutting down while you are still inside it, watching. It is the slow, systematic dismantling of everything you've ever been. The pain, the medication, the gradual loss of the ability to do the things that made you who you were. For a man whose identity was built on the life of the mind, the cruelest part may have been the fog. The way cancer and its treatment cloud the very instrument he'd spent a lifetime sharpening. The man who could describe the architecture of perception with extraordinary clarity could no longer trust his own perceptions. It's not romantic, it's not poetic, it's a process, and the process has no interest in your bibliography. All of his brilliance, all of his philosophical sophistication, all of his decades of thinking about the self cannot do the one thing that actually matters. They cannot keep him company. A man who spent his entire life thinking about the nature of the self, now watching that self come apart. A man who wrote with extraordinary eloquence about the reducing valve of the brain, now experiencing the ultimate reduction. The slow dismantling of everything he'd ever been. And the question is no longer what is consciousness, not what lies beyond the filter. The real question is simpler and far harder. What remains when everything else, the intellect, the identity, the carefully constructed self, is stripped away? What remains is another person, someone in the room, someone who is not afraid. Laura offered herself, her presence, the willingness to enter the most terrifying space a human being can occupy, the space where someone you love is leaving, and to stay there, not to look away, not to intellectualize, not to retreat into abstraction, but to remain fully in the raw, unmediated reality of the moment. She had been preparing for this for her entire life without knowing it. The injury that ended her musical career had taught her what it means to sit in the wreckage of a dissolved identity, to discover that the self is not a thing you hold but a thing you participate in. The years of therapeutic work had taught her that presence is the only thing that actually heals, and that presence costs something real. It costs you the comfort of distance. It costs you the safety of knowing what to say. It costs you the luxury of believing that understanding a problem is the same as being with someone inside it. She'd learned all of this in the work of sitting with people the world had quietly given up on, and now the lesson was being tested in the most extreme way possible. And she did something that carries a weight that's almost impossible to overstate. She administered LSD to her husband on his deathbed. Not as some kind of bohemian experiment. She gave it to him as an act of accompaniment, as a way of saying, I am here, I am with you. You don't have to make this journey alone. Death is not a problem to be solved. It is a passage to be made, and passages require someone to walk beside you. Huxley himself in his final moments wrote a single request on a piece of paper. Cancer had left him unable to speak. The note read, LSD, 100 micrograms, intramuscular. He knew. In the end, the philosopher knew the map was not enough. He needed someone to guide him through the territory. Laura later described what happened after the injection. She said he became calm. She said he seemed to let go of something he'd been holding. The way a person lets go of a handrail in the dark, having finally accepted that someone else is there to steady them. And Laura was there. She'd done the work, the slow, painful work of learning how to be present with another person in their most vulnerable moments. The work that doesn't make it into the biographies, it doesn't get cited in the papers, the work that when the moment comes is the only thing that matters. Huxley died on the 22nd of November 1963, the same day John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and the same day C.S. Lewis died, a strange, almost absurd convergence of endings. The world's attention was elsewhere. The newspapers weren't interested in a dying philosopher. They had a president to mourn, and the guy that wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. And perhaps that's its own kind of truth. The people who change how we think about the minds don't always get the recognition they deserve when they leave it. The room is quiet. The person holding your hand isn't famous. And that's the point. That's the darkest point. The place where the idea collapses into its own implications, where the theory eats itself, where the question stops being academic and becomes existential. She didn't resolve anything. She didn't prove a point. She simply stayed in the room. And in staying, she showed us something no philosophy can teach. Something has broken. not a failure. Something more like a shell cracking open after a long time under pressure. And what is coming out is not what anyone expected. A man who spent his life thinking about the nature of self was forced to watch that self dissolve in his own body in real time. All his thinking, all his extraordinary precision, all his decades of rigorous philosophical inquiry couldn't hold the weight of it. The framework broke. The map was not enough. What emerges from the chaos is not a better theory. It is the recognition that the question itself was wrong. We've been asking, what is consciousness? What happens when the reducing valve opens? What lies beyond the wub? These are good questions, serious questions. Huxley spent his life on them, and he answered them with an eloquence that most philosophers can only envy. But they contain a hidden assumption so deeply embedded it's almost invisible. They assume consciousness is something an individual possesses, a property of a single mind, something you can examine from the outside, describe with sufficient precision, and file neatly alongside your other conclusions. Laura never asked those questions. She was a woman who spoke multiple languages, who trained at one of the finest conservatories in the world, who published 5 books and engaged with some of the most complex ideas of her time. She certainly didn't lack the intelligence for abstract philosophy. But she ignored it for a different reason. Her life had taken her somewhere those questions couldn't reach, not upward into abstraction, which is the danger of much of philosophy, inward into the body, and outward into the space between herself and another person. She knew what it felt like to have an identity stripped away by an injury that no amount of discipline can reverse. She knew the specific silence that fills a room when the music stops and the musician is still sitting there, holding an instrument she can no longer play. She knew what it costs in the body to sit with someone who's falling apart and to resist every impulse to look away, to explain, to fix, to do anything other than stay. This is not a philosophy, it is a practice. And the thing about practice, real practice, the kinds that cost you something, is that it doesn't produce theories. It produces a kind of knowledge that can't be separated from the person who holds it, a knowledge that lives in the body, in the hours spent in rooms with people who are suffering, in the accumulation of presence offered and presence received. Laura didn't arrive at conclusions about consciousness because she'd read the right text. She knew things because she'd lived them in her own body, in the years of sitting with people consumed by their own trauma. She knew them before she ever met Aldous Huxley. Huxley's entire intellectual project was pointing toward the same territory. The self is not fixed. The boundaries are constructed. There's something larger on the other side. He saw it and he described it beautifully. But he couldn't live it. The observer in him wouldn't let go. The intellect held on, even as the body let go, even as the self he'd spent a lifetime examining began to come apart. In the end, the man who described the reducing valve couldn't reduce his own need for it. He couldn't surrender the one thing his entire life had been built around, the observation, the distance, the safety of describing the abyss rather than stepping into it. Laura lived it. Her entire life had been an unwitting preparation for exactly this kind of surrender. The loss of her music taught her what it means to have an identity taken by forces beyond her control. Her therapeutic work taught her what it means to sit with dissolution without reaching for the comfort of an explanation. And her relationship with Aldous, the years of accompanying a brilliant man who could describe anything and surrender to nothing, taught her what it means to enter territory that no map was designed to hold. The two approaches aren't even addressing the same question. They use the same words, consciousness, self, perception, but the questions underneath are entirely different. Huxley was asking what consciousness is. Laura, without ever framing it this way, was asking what consciousness is for. And the answer she arrived at, not through argument, but through a lifetime of practice, through decades of sitting with people in the most extreme moments of their lives, is that consciousness is not a private event. It is not something that happens inside a single skull. It is something that happens between people, in the space where one person reaches for another and doesn't let go. This is what she offered Aldous in his final hours, not a theory about death or a framework for understanding what comes next. She didn't give him a set of beliefs to comfort him as the machinery wound down. She offered him herself, her presence, her willingness to be in the room with the unbearable, to stay there, to not reach for the safety of abstraction when the stakes became truly real. And she offered him the substance that would dissolve the final boundaries between them, not as an escape from the dying, but as a bridge across it, a way of saying, you don't have to make this journey alone. And that's what remains when the intellectual framework's been stripped away, when the map's been torn up and the theories have fallen silent and the beautiful words are no longer any use. Not nothing, not a void, not the cold, empty space that the intellect fears when it contemplates its own insufficiency. Something else entirely. Something the intellect cannot create and cannot destroy because it was never the intellect's to begin with. The question was never what consciousness is. The question was always, who is with you when it happens? After Huxley died, Laura didn't retreat. She was 52 years old and had just accompanied the most intellectually gifted man she'd ever known through the process of dying. The room was quiet, the syringe was empty. The man who'd spent decades mapping the architecture of consciousness was gone. And the question, the one that matters, was what she would do with what she'd learned in that room. She could have spent the rest of her life as his curator, the grieving widow beside the famous husband's legacy, tending the flame, fielding requests for interviews, becoming a minor footnote in the history of psychedelic exploration. Would have been easier, would have been understandable. Grief does not tend toward ambition. But she did something else entirely. In 1977, 16 years after Aldous died, she founded a non-profit organisation called Children, Our Ultimate Investment. Its purpose was deceptively simple: to advocate for the emotional and psychological development of children in the earliest years of life, the years before memory solidifies, the years when the foundations of how a person relates to others, to themselves, to the world, are laid down in ways that will outlast every theory that comes later. She brought together researchers, educators, clinicians. She organised conferences. She wrote about it, spoke about it, pushed for the kind of early years support that most people in positions of influence weren't interested in funding because it doesn't produce neat results on a short timetable. The work was slow. It was bureaucratic. It required the kind of patience that makes people who want to change the world tear their hair out. It was, by any measure, the opposite of a deathbed revelation. There was nothing glamorous about it. There was nobody filming it. If Laura's understanding of consciousness had been a single moment of insight, a flash of the divine afforded by extreme circumstances, she would have preserved it, polished it, built a philosophy around it. Become the kind of person who gives talks about the time she watched Aldous Huxley die. She would have become a guru, and the work, the decades of patient showing up, would have been forgotten in favour of the story. Instead, she did something far less dramatic and far more difficult. She got on with the work. The same work she'd been doing before she ever met Huxley, sitting with people who were struggling, refusing to look away, not in search of a transcendent experience, in search of the next person who needed someone in the room. There's a version of this story where Laura Huxley is a footnote, the wife of a famous man, the woman who was there at the end, who held his hand, who administered the dose. That's how the history of psychedelic exploration has mostly remembered her, when it has remembered her at all. A margin note in someone else's biography, a name attached to a famous death. But the footnote version misses something really important. It misses the 40 years she lived after Aldous died. 40 years, nearly half her life. The 40 years of work, of writing, of teaching, of applying everything she'd learned in the most extreme circumstances imaginable to the ordinary, daily difficulty of being alive and being with others. She published 5 books between 1963 and 1987. She developed programs for child development. She gave talks. She sat with people. She founded an organisation and ran it for years. She didn't stop. She didn't need the dramatic context of a deathbed to sustain what she understood. The understanding wasn't in the drama. It was in the practice. It had always been in the practice. And this is why I wanted to get to with this story, not with a revelation, but with a question. What Laura's life makes visible is something the philosophical tradition has always quietly resisted. The suggestion that the most important dimensions of human experience are not the ones we can think our way through. They are the ones we can only inhabit. And inhabiting them requires something the intellect on its own cannot provide. It requires the willingness to be changed by what you encounter, to take the thing you have learned in the most intense moments of your life and apply it, not to the next intense moment, but to the next ordinary day, the next difficult conversation, the next person who needs you to simply be in the room. Because that's what presence actually is. It's not a peak experience. It's not a deathbed or a psychedelic session or a moment of sudden waking up. It is the choice made over and over and over again to be in the room with another person, to not reach for the explanation, to not retreat into the safety of what you think you know, to not construct a theory that lets you observe the difficulty from a comfortable distance. To stay. Huxley in his final hours reached for the one thing that could keep him company through the dissolution of everything he'd been. Not his books or his theories. A person. The person who'd been there all along. The person who understood in a way that no philosophy can teach that the territory is not something you survey. And Laura had carried that understanding her whole life. From the concert stage in Florence, where she first felt the boundary between musician and music dissolve, and understood something about the space between people that she couldn't yet articulate. Through the injury that stripped away everything she thought she was, and the long, unsentimental reckoning with the question of who remained. Through years of sitting with people whose worlds had collapsed, she carried it to Huxley's deathbed, and she carried it past it, and she carried it into the rest of her life, and gave it to anyone who was willing to receive it. The connections we form with each other are not incidental to the experience of being human. They are the experience. And the most important thing we will ever do is not to think our way to the right answer. It's to reach for the person beside us and to stay. There's a moment I keep returning to. Not the deathbed or the syringe or the famous final hours that have been written about and turned into the kind of story that fits neatly into the history of psychedelic exploration. I keep returning to something that happened long before any of it. A young woman in Florence drawing a bow across strings, feeling the music move through her body, understanding in that moment that she was not separate from what she was creating, that the boundary between the musician and the music was, in some fundamental sense, an illusion. That the most real thing in the room was not the instrument, not the performer, not the audience. It was the connection. The invisible thread between the one who played and the one who listened. A thread that made them, for the duration of the piece, a single thing. And then the injury, the silence, the long, terrible reckoning with the question of who she was when the music stopped. Loss is not merely the absence of something. It is the presence of a question. A question you cannot evade by constructing a new identity on top of the old one. You can carry on, you can function. You can perform recovery so convincingly that no one notices the doors that have been closed. Some essential perception that will never open again. Laura did something different. She didn't build on top of the loss, she went through it. She sat in the remains of who she'd been and asked the only question that matters. What's there when everything you thought you were is taken away? What she found wasn't nothing. It was a connection. A recognition is that the self is not a thing you hold, but a thing you participate in. I want you to remember that. If anything, if you take one thing away from this episode, it's that. The self is not a thing you hold, but a thing you participate in. She carried that understanding into everything that followed, into her therapeutic work, into her marriage, into the extraordinary, beautiful act of accompanying Aldous Huxley into the final territory. And she carried it after his death into the rest of her life, into teaching, into writing, into the work of showing up for another person and refusing to look away. I want to leave you with an image. A woman in a room, a man who's dying, a hand reaching for another hand, and in that reaching, in that simple, devastating act of connection, the whole story, the whole truth. We were never meant to be alone. And the most important thing we will ever do is not to think our way to the right answer. It is to reach for the person beside us and to hold on. That is the whole of it. Thank you, you beautiful lot, for tuning in today. Your time, your presence, and your attention are, as always, deeply appreciated. If you want to keep wandering through this philosophical wreckage with me, you can find the show in all the usual digital purgatories, my favourite places. We are on TikTok, Instagram and X with the handle @TheObservingEye. We are on YouTube at youtube.com/@TheObservingEye. And we are on Substack, which is the home of the podcast, @TheObservingEye.com. And of course, you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever platform you use to deliver these sensory wonders into your ear holes. You can drop me an email at david@theobservingeye.com. I read all of them and I do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. So if you want to recommend a subject for an episode, you want to say hi, anything like that, feel free to send me a message. We'll be back next week, continuing our Realm of the Psychonaut season. As always, I haven't quite decided who I'm going to do yet, so it'll be as much as a surprise to you as it is to me. But do come back for that though. Until then, take care everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.